Abraham, and we talked about Abraham and how he knew he would become a great nation. He received his great name and all the blessings of the whole world. And then we got to Moses, but it took a really long time.
It did take a long time to get from Abraham to Moses. Actually, you can read from Genesis 23 all the way to Exodus 1. And why was it taking so long? Well, it takes a really long time to create a nation. Like, they needed generation after generation. So Abraham, he has Jacob, who later his name is changed to Israel. And he has 12 sons, which, you know, these represent things that we know of. It represents 12 tribes of Israel, okay? They end up moving to Egypt. There's famine that struck the land, and it's a great story. You can read all about it in the Bible. But they move to Egypt, and again, God is, it seems like he's taking forever to fulfill this covenant, but it takes a long time for this nation to grow. But you know, not everything was great when they were in Egypt.
And part of the problem is because their nation did grow. It grew so strong and so numerous that Pharaoh became very concerned about how many Jewish babies were being born. He was afraid that he was going to lose this free, cheap labor and that they were going to overthrow him. So he came up with this great plan, and he told all the midwives that they were to kill all Jewish male babies that were born. And many of the midwives would have nothing to do with that, and that was the case with Moses, which is why we ended up having Moses in the line of Jesus. Otherwise, he could have been treated like some of the other young males.
So this time they're slaves
Right.
in Egypt,
Mm-hmm.
but you know, some of them, they didn't forget their God. They were moaning and groaning against being these slaves, and they were really reaching out to God to please save us. So our Lord does help. He comes to our cry.
Mm-hmm. And that's what happened kind of with Moses' mother, because she did not want her son to be killed, so she put him in the basket, as we know, and she floated him down the Nile. So that took a great deal of trust that God would take care of her child, and sure enough, that's exactly what happened. Pharaoh's sister actually found baby Moses in the basket. She rescued him, and she raised him as her own son. So Moses grew up in this wonderful, he grew up as a royalty. And he had the ability to follow God's A-plan, number one plan, and free the Jewish people from their slavery. If he had just sat still and waited his time, he could have freed the Jewish people when he became the ruler, because he was actually in line for that. But it's so
messed up.
Yep. Go ahead, you know the story.
Well, he messed up by trying to defend one of the slaves, and he saw how the Egyptians were beating him as a slave, and he went and he killed this Egyptian, and then he knew that the other Egyptians were going to see what he was doing, and he's supposed to be one of them, so he buries him in the sand of all places. So it just, he runs, he fled.
Because the wind blew the sand off the body, he was discovered, and he had to flee. And so he ends up going off into the desert. He traveled quite a ways, and he ends up working as a shepherd again, for many, many years. And one day he is out, and he sees the burning bush. We all know that story. The bush is on fire, but it's not being consumed. And as he approaches the bush, their voice comes from the bush, tells him to take off his shoes because he's on sacred ground. God gives him the message that he is to go to Pharaoh and ask for the people to be let go and to come to worship him again. And Moses asks the question of, who am I to say is sending me? And God gives that famous line that I think all of us know, and he says, say that I am who am. Say, I am has sent you. By saying this, God identifies himself as the one true God who actually exists. All the other gods are false, are fake. They are not true, but God is.
And we need to remember that when he's saying this name, they knew that names were very important. They didn't just, and some names are important to us now, but a lot of times they do have meaning, and a lot of people sometimes, this sounds good, or this name's kind of trendy, and that's why they do it. But in their day, their names meant the reality of who the person was. So for him to say, I am who I am, you're right, he's showing I am the one true God. And Pharaoh would have to really look at that, because they had lots of gods that they looked to. And they all had different names that meant something, but nobody had this name like God had.
Right. And God, he is helping Pharaoh when he sends the plagues. It may sound very odd, but he's actually helping Pharaoh and the Egyptians to see just what he had said. He is the one and only true God. Each one of the plagues addresses one of their gods. The sun god, when the sky became dark; the god of the Nile, when he turned the water into blood. Each one of those plagues was sent with a particular meaning that they knew. He was showing them that God was false and that he was the one and only true God that they could trust and who would defend them.
Now, after this, they end up being freed from Egypt. And I do think we just have to remember that God is again using Moses as a mediator. He wants all his people to be saved. And he was using Moses to not only tell his own people, but to tell the Egyptians, to tell Pharaoh, to tell everybody about who the one to follow him, the one true God. So again, a mediator going to tell everyone about the Lord and how he calls us to himself.
And by sending those plagues, God, he was teaching the Egyptians that their religion was false, that they needed to follow him, and he was the one true God. They needed to worship him instead.
So then we get to the covenant, the actual covenant, which Moses makes with the people. He's the mediator, and it takes place in Sinai, the desert. And we see that there's, again, the covenant's turning to that family bond. He's trying to bring them back into that covenantal relationship with himself. And so after they travel, they get to a mountain again. Okay? Always seems
Where
to
we
be
can meet the Lord.
Yep. And so Moses does just that. He goes up the mountain to meet the Lord. And we know what he gets when he's up on the top of that mountain. He gets those family rules, which are the
Ten Commandments.
Yep. All families are going to need rules to live by, or it's chaos. And God knows that because he created us.
And I think it's sometimes hard, just even to bring this to now. People look at rules in all different ways, and sometimes we fail to see that rules are there out of love, for protection and guidance. And a lot of times, we just don't see it that way. But God is all loving and all merciful, and he wants us, if we follow these, we will be free from sin, and just free to love and follow him.
And if you look at the Ten Commandments, he really helps us because the first three are ordered towards how we treat God. So we put the first set of rules comes how we treat God. If we keep those perfectly, the other 7 are very, very easy to keep, or they should be. Being humans, they aren't always so easy for us to keep. But when Moses goes up and he receives the 10 Commandments from God, he comes back down, and the people notice there's something different about Moses. His face is shiny, he glows. Something's happened to him when he was up the mountain.
He reflects the Lord. He reflects God himself.
And because God spoke to Moses, now Moses as mediator is going to speak to God. But because God is not visible to anybody else other than Moses, he has to show us, in a sense, what took place. And so this is where this blood oath comes in, or this blood sacrifice. And after Moses comes down, this is found in Exodus 24. Moses comes down and he takes half the blood of the sacrifice of the animals, and he sprinkles it on the people. And then he takes half the blood and he throws it on this altar that he has built. Well, the altar represents God's presence, and the throwing the blood on the altar and on the people meant that they now shared one blood. there is the covenant. That familial bond is there. They share the blood of God. They are all now part of his family.
And you know, it kind of reminds me of our covenant with Abraham, where God cut the animals in two and was taking the blood. I mean, we have to see how this goes from one to the next, which is going to lead up to our ending covenant, right, with the Lord himself, with Jesus, and shedding his own blood for us.
And even though it's very, very beautiful, there is a darker meaning to this whole thing too. It says, it really tells us that if either party were to break the covenant, may his blood be shed. So Moses ends the ceremony with the solemn words, behold, the blood of the covenant which the Lord has made with you. They end there, but that's not where it stops. They go and they eat and drink with God. They have this meal with him. Again, very symbolic as to what we are going to see in future covenants.
Yeah. So they want to have this relationship with God all the time. And the Lord, I mean, he really does say that this can happen, and he wants his presence to be there. So they need to make a tabernacle that God can dwell in, to be with them. Now, Moses he has to go get some directions for this tabernacle.
But again, it takes a long time.
So he goes up the mountain again, and he is getting the directions for building this tabernacle, this new Eden.
Instructions
Yeah.
for like making a tent. Have either of you ever had to have instructions for making
Oh, yeah.
a tent?
Mhm.
Yeah, well, I can hardly follow those instructions, so I'm sure it did take a long time.
And they were very precise, and they had all sorts of meaning behind them, all the different parts of it. So you're right, it took a really long time. And so we know that the people down below, they're human, so what did they probably end up doing? Did they follow them? They fell down. So everybody knows that story. It's the golden calf.
Yeah.
They built this golden calf and they were worshiping him. But did you know that the golden calf is actually one of the gods of Egypt?
They went back to their old ways.
Yep.
Old habits are really, really hard to break.
And when Moses came down, he was not happy at all. He actually threw the tablets, they broke. I mean, it was not good. He was very upset. When he went to Aaron tries to well, they made me do it. He passes off, remind you of anybody else. Well, she made me eat the apple, and he made me take the apple, and we're back to the same old thing again. We don't learn. And that's what happens for the rest of the book of Deuteronomy.
Yeah,
They didn't learn.
they did it, and they kept, so they would keep having to have new rules. Moses would have to give them rules, but it wasn't because the rules were bad. It was out of love for them that they would follow them and just,
Draw closer to God.
yes,
Wanted them.
so they were assigned to Israel because of Israel's sin. They keep sinning, so they would need another rule. And we know by the end of this, there's 613 rules.
Exactly.
That's a lot to take in.
And we know that too, when God does this, he gives us an example of that today for us. I mean, we're sitting outside the Reconciliation Chapel right now as we are filming this. And we know that when we go to receive the sacrament of reconciliation, that after we confess our sins to the priest, he gives us a penance, which is not to be cruel and to be mean. It is to help us to reform our ways or change our ways, conversion, and come back to him. So that's basically, I mean, this is our modern day version of what happened to the Jewish people as they were wandering the desert. So at the end of this, Moses doesn't get to enter into the promised land.
He doesn't, but he gets a view of it. He climbs up another mountain, and the Lord shows him a view of the promised land. It's still going to take some time for them to enter the promised land, but it's there. They can almost see it and taste it, that land of milk and honey, and they're on their way to this next covenant that we will be sharing with you next week.
So stay tuned.